Welcome to another episode of Into the Foxhole. I'm Jeff Fox. This is episode number 6, and today we're going to talk about mental health. We're going to talk about mental health in Florida as well as in the United States. And today I'm joined by two mental health professionals, two licensed mental health counselors working right here in Tampa, Matt Rigberg
Hey, Jeff. Happy to be here.
and Angel
Thanks.
Lopez.
Hi, Jeff. Happy to be here.
So I wanted to have you guys on because for a while I've been thinking about having a conversation about mental health. I'm sure that you both recognize, just as I do, how important it is. Especially we've seen in the last decade many instances of things that probably could have been avoided if proper mental health care was in place. So what I wanted to address first is mental health in our state in which we work. And just to give people some background, I'm currently studying in psychology and I was working in behavioral health myself for about a year and a half, working in the public sector and working with the homeless, a place in which I saw many of the barriers and the pitfalls that people face when they don't have access to proper services. What I wanted to talk about first is in Florida, and I'll pose this question to both of you guys. On a scale of 1 to 10, and I'll ask you first, Matt, and then I'll go to you, Angel. On a scale of 1 to 10, where is Florida's mental health sector at?
Well, I'd say probably around 3, 4, perhaps.
Oh, boy.
I don't have a huge frame of reference in terms of working in mental health in other states.
Yeah.
But similar to your background, what you were describing, my first couple of years after I finished my degree, I worked first at Tampa General Hospital in the inpatient unit, where we saw a fair amount of people without insurance or people with minimal insurance. And then I moved over to community mental health. At the time, it was called Mental Health Care. Now it's called Grace Point. That is set up to service people with Medicare, Medicaid, state-run insurance, some private stuff, but not that's not usually where people with private insurance would choose to go.
Right.
And so my experiences there were pretty telling in terms of quality of care. And I would read about quality of care in Massachusetts, who I think has, a lot of funding for mental health care. Or even sometimes I would have a client that would tell me, oh, I just moved from New York, or I just moved from Boston, and things are so much better up there.
Yeah, I've heard some similar things.
Which is also very associated to mental health because, mental health is so significant with the homeless.
Yeah.
Right.
But what I was just going to say two things because Matt mentioned two big important things that really block services. One is insurance, definitely, and the way insurance dictates treatment at times and allows certain amount of sessions. But also what's helping, because I think Florida is a little better than a 4 and a 5. I would say we're about a 6.
Yeah.
But what's also helping is that socially also, remember in the 80s, 70s, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, these things were never really talked about. They're really denied and swept under the rug socially. So I think a big part that's helping is that socially people are starting to see it and accept it and realize that it's not a weakness, that it's something that we all deal with and that we all sometimes might need therapy or help with.
Yeah.
So I think that helps, that socially people are accepting it more. I think, and that's going to help for people to advocate and get these insurance things changed. But also in those areas like up north, like Boston, New York, California, they are ahead of us because they're places that are more populated. So they needed a lot more services and they needed to hurry up. And we're behind, definitely, in that way.
Yeah.
But now Florida's getting very populated. And I think that's really gonna make them, hit crunch time and hopefully provide more services.
Well, and I would say, at least from my understanding, a lot of it comes to funding, and Florida has notoriously been towards the bottom in terms of, compared to other states in the country in terms of funding for mental health services. And I think it starts there, right? If that's, supporting the people that need it the most or the people that can afford it the least, then things seem to progress well from that point. And so I know Massachusetts, New York, California have much larger budgets for mental health care. And yes, they're more populated, and yes, they pay more taxes to live there. But I think there's also a political differences of opinion in those states as opposed to Florida.
Yeah, I think you touched on something very worth noting there, Matt. Politics is definitely going to play into it. And as far as the funding thing you were talking about, it did make me think of where I worked, working for an organization that seeks to overcome substance abuse and homelessness, but is largely underfunded and lacks resources. Particularly, I remember when I was a case manager trying to help people, that it wasn't easy for me to say, oh yeah, we'll refer you to this person over here. I often felt, I felt kind of like a detective in a way, that everything was very piecemeal. I had to spend a lot of time looking for resources just for a place to refer a person to go, oh, here's where you would go to try to take care of that.
Right. Or even I remember when things as simple or basic seeming as a bus pass used to be a commodity, and you would have to barter for them. You would have to use them as a way to motivate a client to do something, like something that, probably shouldn't be as restricted as it was.
Yeah, I played that bus pass game. But, that was an interesting position to be in, talking about like people's political views and beliefs, or just, social views. There's definitely stigmas surrounding the homeless. A lot of people who will say, oh, well, they just don't work hard enough. Those people are lazy.
Right.
Oh, yeah, there's definitely that social stigma where, when with addiction and with the homeless and with the mentally ill, that they get put in like an inferior position, that they're less than.
Right.
And that's why socially they get neglected.
Right.
Because, people also, when they're doing well, and they're paying their bills and meeting their world is happy, their empathy goes out the window,
Right.
because, their world, they're jumping in their pools and having fun and then their empathy flies out the window. And then sometimes you do have that stigma, as you say, that, socially, they put them in an inferior position. And
right.
they, when I worked in substance abuse, that was a big part of the word addiction, that because it was hard for them to even say that word at times, because it has such a social stigma with you're a bad person, which it does not mean that you're a bad person. You have a disease, or you have an addiction. I mean, I've worked in it, and these people were awesome people, and they all have underlying stuff going on too that led to their substance use. But that inferior position that socially people, do to protect themselves or make themselves feel better is something that we need to break socially. That it's judgmental.
Yeah.
It's like, look, people are not perfect. People, some people are on top, people are on bottom, and it shifts because at any time things can change.
Right.
And
there's all kinds of in-betweens.
Yeah. And I think that's a big part that people need to talk about and teach even their children, not to see people in those positions in an inferior way.
Yeah, well put, man. You put it very well, but I was going to comment on how, like, people tend to seek a way to oversimplify things and go, well, it's this, it's right or it's wrong, without looking at the multitude of factors that go into what lands a person in that position. And I'll be honest, working in that field, I did meet a couple of people who were in the game of kind of, as we used to say in the line of work, shelter hopping, people who just wanted to kind of take advantage of the services that were given without putting in the necessary work. But those people were a very small percentage, and the majority of the clients wanted to try to improve their lives. But, oftentimes people are dismissive or not even thinking about all of the factors that could go into why this person's in this position, like, past trauma, substance abuse disorders, other mental health issues. Because, I found in my line of work that trauma was often overlapping with pre-existing conditions like bipolar disorders or types of schizophrenic disorders that, these people would seem to end up in circumstances that led to them experiencing a trauma because of those things, So there was all these overlapping factors.
Yes. And a lot of underlying stuff that if people, like I said, would be more empathetic and not be judgmental and actually realize that there's a life story here, that underlying factors, could have attributed to where they're at, and not be closed-minded, be more open-minded and not closed-minded. This person is addict, so they're a screw-up,
Right.
That's very closed-minded.
To put it more bluntly, we should realize how we're all a little fucked up.
Yeah. Don't deny it.
Right. So
and I think, maybe part of it is, at least from an American cultural standpoint, we seem to like, the quote unquote American dream story, or rising from nothing to make something of yourself, right? Like when you put together a slick package of a homeless person that has a great voice and becomes a singer for a little bit, or even a couple of years ago, do you remember there was a guy that had this great announcer voice on the side of the road, and the Cleveland Cavaliers hired him to do the sports games for a little bit until I think he ended up relapsing, unfortunately.
No, but I felt like there was.
Yeah, it was like
I felt like there was one of those shows like America's Got Talent where somebody, like maybe a homeless person, came on and had this amazing voice.
Those sorts of ideas where, just when you put it together and you make it look good, I think to Angel's point, it does allow people to have empathy for another person. They're almost like, if you make it entertaining enough, you'd be interested in learning a person's story. But instead, if you're just kind of casting judgment on people, or using the reverse American dream story in the sense of this person has thrown away everything, and look at them, they clearly they don't want to do better for themselves because they don't have a job, or they want to collect unemployment, or X, Y, and Z. I think it can become very, very judgmental. Sometimes that's because the person is uncomfortable seeing it, or they haven't been exposed to the realities of the place that they live in, or they make themselves feel better by putting another person down. Right? I think those are all.
Oh, that's a great point, Matt. That's a great one right there, because remember how I mentioned just now that socially we put ourselves in put those people that have addictions and mental health, quote unquote mental health issues. Sometimes people put them in inferior positions, right? They're an addict, they got issues, right? Matt also made a good point there that it makes them feel good, because then they're putting themselves in a superior position.
Yeah,
they're kicking butt, they're making the right decisions, life is great, and let me feed my ego a little bit, and that's mindfulness and being aware that you don't do that you don't feed your egos in that way, because it will lead to judgmental, it will lead to closed-minded.
Yeah.
And instead of being more open-minded and accepting that, there's nothing wrong with it. It's okay, and you don't have to put an opinion on someone that you don't even know that might have a substance abuse problem. Because there's also a level of anxiety there too. Because why are you anxious about that you want to make these assumptions and predictions about this person instead of just accepting them for what they are and getting to know them wherever they are in their life, if they're in the bad or they're in the good or whatever. But can you accept that and get to know that individual for who they are in that moment?
Yeah, you could at least hear a little bit of their story.
Oh yeah, I'll be honest with you. One of my things in therapy that I tend to use a lot, and I got it from and I'm going to be honest, I got it from. I don't watch the show typically, and it was actually Dr. Phil. And he one of the things he said that through his life doing therapy was that a lot of people's angers and anxieties and insecurities and judgmental stuff is because they have issues accepting their personal truth, their life story.
Mm-hmm.
And if people worked more on accepting like their personal truth, their life story, instead of living in denial or trying to write a narrative, like that.
Right.
We learned as kids, we learned like, oh, we got to get married and have kids, and we got to stay married to this person and grow old and have kids. And then if that narrative doesn't happen and they deal with divorce and trauma,
Yeah.
and all these negative things, then it's hard for them to find acceptance. It's hard to, and a lot of the issues I deal with at times is that people fighting, their personal truth, and they have a lot of anger and anxiety, and actually that I heard that on Dr.
Right.
Phil that part of it, So
You actually made me think about several clients that I'd interacted with where really like the biggest obstacle for me to try to help this person grow was their own denial of their own story.
yeah, because remember, in the level of anger related to that,
Oh, yeah.
Because I do see that, of anger, of not accepting certain things, and then, you mask it with the substance use.
Right.
Because, I actually have another good quote that I got from a man named Archie that worked at DACO.
Mm-hmm.
His it didn't make complete sense, but his acronym for denial was "Don't even know I am lying." Because, people that are heavy in denial, they're writing their narrative. They're writing their script. They are completely lying to themselves. And to wake them up and having to face their truth is very difficult. Because it could be because of trauma. It could be, a lot of, people that are foster children have a hard time with it, that have never met their parents,
Uh-huh.
There's certain people that have a really hard time accepting personal truth because they have a very hard personal truth to accept.
Yeah, it was often part of my job, because if I'm going and say, all right, well, my job here is to help you take 2 steps forward. The first time that they took a step backward, I go, okay, well, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt that, this happened, or you just had to do this thing. But probably by like the 3rd time, they're going, oh, well, I missed that appointment due to this, or, I lost this job because I did this. I would eventually be saying, all right, I need you to see that the decisions you're making are impacting you in a negative way, that you're not making the best decisions based on what you need. And sometimes, like you said, that would result in some anger or even tears. But, like 4 out of 5 times, that client would come back to me later and go, hey, just wanted to tell you that, like, you're right, and that's something that I got to work on. So I wanted to talk about the homelessness epidemic. And, like, it's pretty good timing, actually, because there's been this concept discussed in the last week or so of defunding the police, which I think there's a big misconception about it based on what a lot of talking heads have said, which they equate to like, oh, they want to get rid of the police. No, it actually means like taking money that's being funneled into police to take some of that and pay for other things like mental health services and some homeless services. Mm-hmm. And so it just made me think, one of the things that I saw all the time working with the homeless was the revolving door in and out of jail, and how sometimes people would rack up so many charges, and usually people that had very high mental health, lots of mental health issues going on, that if somebody could have just approached this person and talked to them, they probably could have not gone to jail that day. So what do you guys think?
No, when that story that you just said, when that client probably didn't have to go to jail that day, Are you also referring to the fact that also with the police of them getting better training dealing with victims of trauma and mental health, people that have mental health?
Well, part of the conversation about defunding and putting the money into other things like mental health services is you're more properly funding people who like specifically study in mental health and people who's specifically trained to handle people who've dealt with trauma. But I'm sure they could train police in that better as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think so. Definitely, because even issues what occurred recently, up there,
Right.
There's a mental health factor there. So no, I do think police definitely need a lot more training in dealing with people with, through my own experience and what I've seen, that they do need more training in dealing with people that have mental health and trauma.
Just interpersonal skills. I don't want to make
Sometimes,
it.
as a,
Go ahead.
well, you got to remember there is a level of anxiety in being a cop because
Right.
you are putting yourself at risk out there, and there's a certain level of worry and stuff.
Yeah.
So there's these cops need that mental health because there is a level of anxiety and there's a level of trauma with them and what they see. So they need mental health. They need to be talking to people, and they also be more practiced to be, because remember, some of them are trained in to follow protocol, and sometimes with trauma victims or you're dealing with someone with mental health, you might have to become adaptable, and certain protocol is not going to work. And that's the kind of training I'm talking about, like where they can identify things and know, because I've seen things in my personal experience where, they weren't relating to the person, and it was because they were having a mental health issue, and they really didn't identify it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I guess one of the buzzier words that's been spoken about lately is de-escalation.
Uh-huh.
Whether we're talking about how some police forces have interacted with peaceful protests. We see some police officers marching with the protesters, or some police officers taking a knee, or some police officers having a conversation, right? And I think in most of those cases, there's no violence, and obviously I think I don't need to necessarily state this, but when police start acting in aggressive ways, of course, protesters or crowds are going to start to become unruly. I remember, whether I was at the hospital or at Grace Point, every year we had to go through de-escalation training because, first of all, sometimes we're dealing with people that aren't totally stable from a mental point of view.
Yeah.
And so we have to know how to handle those situations. But also it really works on creating empathy for the patient. I imagine police officers go through de-escalation training, but I think the kind of person that's drawn to the police force is very different from the kind of person that's drawn to mental health. And so I'm not sure how those de-escalation trainings are received by the police force. Obviously, we know they work because we've seen them in play.
Yeah.
And we know what happens when they're not used.
Mm-hmm.
But you're still having to deal with quite a edifice of bureaucracy to start to make changes in how the police force might handle certain situations.
Yeah, this conversation makes me think about a guy that I've known for over 20 years who comes from a law enforcement family, although he is not a law enforcement officer himself. And a couple of weeks ago, he was basically explaining how he feels like there is a culture in law enforcement that is much more about speaking to a person instead of speaking with somebody. And he was painting an example of how he was trying to tell his father something, and his father was just like, it was something about like he made a Facebook post, and the father's response was, I didn't like your Facebook post. That was like one message, and then the next message was like, we're going to have a talk. And just that verbiage right there, to me, sort of has solidified his point, which was like, I think an open-minded person who wanted to have a conversation would say, hey, can we talk?
You're giving a good example of someone that also is, mental health could also identify within the police field and these positions where people have power, right, is your power and control guys in people.
Yeah.
Because these are the people that you have to identify, because they're going to need mental health services, and they're going to need to know if they're able to even perform the job. Because these people that go into, they're officers by 20 years old, and they have some unresolved issues and have power and control issues, you got to be careful, giving that guy a gun and give him all that power.
Mm-hmm. Or people that served in the military and then moved into the police force.
Yeah.
Right? Potentially extra layers of trauma there.
Oh, yeah. Because remember, I mean, you got a level of maybe even PTSD there, and then is this person ready for more trauma?
Right.
So it's like they have work to do about being more mindful of how the protocol at times is to even be a cop now. Like, I think they need, stiffer guidelines in a way, and like, and Matt just made a really good point. Like, because if a guy goes to the military and he's all, living, I don't know, and whatever, he could be trauma, and he could, be denying a lot of things that he's not dealing with inside internally.
Yeah.
And still externally looking for things to do and achieve power, and then goes to be a cop. You're putting a guy there that's very vulnerable to, how is this guy going to deal with certain stress and pressure and fear, And if you put him in those situations, like, is he bound to, psychologically break or lose it,
I don't know if either of you saw Dave Chappelle, I guess, and Netflix put something up on YouTube the other day.
No.
It's very poignant. It's not terribly funny, which kind of makes sense for the times that we're in.
Right.
But he's telling some stories about the killing of George Floyd and the other, police killings or murders that have happened in America's history. And he cites 2 or 3, maybe 4 specific times where, in his words, the streets come back and kill police officers. And interestingly, every time, at least in the stories that he shares, the person committing the violence against police officers has a military background. And Dave Chappelle's point was that people in the military are trained to combat evil. And if these people recognize what's happening in their world or in their community as evil, maybe that's what motivates them to then commit more horrific acts.
Oh yeah, because remember, we're talking about empathy, but there's a big extremism part is like you're training people to kill, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you're training people to kill, and then you want them to come back and be all sensitive and empathetic and lovey-dovey.
Right.
You talk about a mind warp, and because remember, there's even a level of training and mental, you can say preparedness, brainwashing, whatever you want to call it, but there's a level of that in the military to even get someone to go do that.
Right. You got to break someone down before you can build them back up.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that and this is on the VA and all of them. That. There should be a lot more transitional planning when these guys get back.
Yeah.
Sure.
To get their empathies back, to get their feelings back, because when they're out there, they got to turn off a lot of feelings.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then you want them to come back and live a normal life and raise kids and work and be. No, but you're putting them in such a bad place, and like with the VA, there has to be so much more, transitional planning when they come back, especially if they were active and all those types of things. So
what comes to mind is USF started a program sometime within like the last 7 years, designed specifically for that, to try to reintegrate veterans back into society, and
yes,
that was one of the chief reasons was, look, you can't just expect that when someone comes back and gets off the plane that they can just walk right back into civilian life. It doesn't really work that way. This is a seamless segue into my next topic was veterans, which I can't tell you how many times I've seen that like a veteran with PTSD that goes untreated ends up homeless. We ask someone to dedicate their life to this country. We ask them to, like Angel was saying, compartmentalize and turn off so many parts of of their human, of what it means to be human, and their emotions, to go fight in war. And then we bring them back, and we, essentially they're plopped back into society, and we go, all right, well, have a good one. That's just not, it's not how it should work at all. They already know that post-traumatic stress syndrome is a very real problem with veterans coming back from war. So why isn't there a comprehensive system for handling that?
It's interesting. I did one of my internships towards the end of my graduate program at the VA, and I worked with this group called MICM, which stands for Mental Health Intensive Case Management. And it was a group of people that were mobile. So you would travel to veterans' homes or apartments or assisted living facilities and essentially check in on them and make sure that they're getting the right medicines, make sure that they have groceries. If they need help getting groceries, you could take them or take them on outings. These were, what we would consider severe and persistently mentally ill individuals. But serious stuff that manifested at some point while the individual was enlisted in the military. And so it was, Florida has a program like that on a larger scale, but this was specifically for veterans. And so I was able to not just work with that team and get to know veterans. I was also able to kind of co-lead different groups that they offered at the VA Center for veterans, whether it was anger management or substance abuse, or there was also a general processing group. It's sort of like a stereotypical group therapy session. So services are there. I think that sometimes the VA gets a bad rap or a negative stigma from the veterans themselves because they don't think that they get the best care. And I think sometimes that's a very substantiated thought. And I think there also is a stigma about what kind of person goes to the VA. I think that maybe there's a reluctance from veterans to even want to enter that system. So again, I guess we probably have to start with funding when it comes to taking care of the veterans.
Yeah.
I think there's more money there than there is, for example, for the state of Florida. The Haley VA is a pretty impressive facility, and they're expanding, and they have a brain injury wing, and they have a pretty large hospital. But I guess to the other point, which is reintegrating people. When you guys were having the conversation, I kept thinking of the term conditioning, right? And so to enlist into the military and to go through boot camp, you are being conditioned, right? To not think for yourself, to think as a group, to react to commands, to do what you're told, those sorts of things. But no one's ever, you don't really hear of veterans coming back being quote unquote deconditioned, right? To say like, okay, now we're going to talk about how to readjust to civilian life.
Yeah.
There are programs in place. I can't speak to their effectiveness or the participation numbers, but I know that they're there. But from our, I guess, anecdotal evidence, it seems like we don't know a lot of people that have gone through those programs. Or when someone that has a military background does something problematic and related to post-traumatic stress disorder, like you said, Jeff. I absolutely agree with, I think, what the both of you are saying is that we could definitely do a better job helping veterans transition away from the military into civilian life.
Yes, sir, definitely. So I know we talked about stigmas already a little bit, so I don't want to be redundant or anything. But of course, just as we were talking about, and directly dealing with some clients, one of the biggest obstacles can be the client themselves being in denial. I just wanted to address real quick how some people still go straight to using the word crazy whenever mental health comes up. That if you were to say, well, I think you should, go see a professional. Well, I'm not crazy, so I don't need to. And Matt, I'd like to direct this to you first because you told me we had a conversation once about this word.
Yeah, I remember it. In public, wasn't it?
I want to say we were at a social gathering.
Oh, okay. Well, then edit that part out.
We did talk on the frozen food aisle before, though.
Yeah, I remember that. That was fun. But yeah, so we have talked about it in the past. It's not a word that I like. It's a shortcut. It's shorthand, right?
Yeah.
And I get it, but I think to your point, Jeff, it does perpetuate this negative connotation of mental health or of services, therapy, counseling. I don't know if we've had a conversation about this too, but I've even tried to stop calling someone mentally ill or talking about it in the context of mental illness, because I think that also carries a pretty negative connotation.
Yeah.
And anything to try to detract from the stigma of it, I think, is important. I will say from the work that I've been doing for the last couple of years with a very different population than we've been spending most of this time talking about. I have worked with a fair amount of teenagers and college students, and it's my observations that generation, people born in the 2000s, seem to have a very different perspective of mental health care than maybe people of our generations and older.
Right.
That's people born in the 80s and older. And a lot of these teenagers are very empathetic and quote unquote woke. And they do not see having anxiety or depression as a weakness, but something that can be addressed.
Yeah.
As we see media expand into dealing with mental health issues, I think Netflix has probably produced a lot of content about people with depression, people with anxiety, people with more serious mental health disorders. I think Instagram and other social platforms have allowed people to be more outspoken about their problems.
Yeah.
I remember probably not even 15 years ago, there was like 2 books that you could refer to someone that like were written by somewhat public figures about their issues with mental health. And one of them was Kitty Dukakis, the former presidential candidate, Michael Dukakis' wife, because she has bipolar disorder. So I am emboldened by the next generation or the current teenager millennial generation, that they seem to be a lot more open-minded about not just the importance of mental health services, but about actively working on themselves to get past some of these issues.
That's awesome. That makes me very optimistic too. I will say that from people in our generation and possibly older, I will often hear bashing of people who are younger than us, which I'm sure has been happening for hundreds of years.
That's right.
But I often stick up for them because I'm like, well, actually, a lot of people I've met who are younger than me seem much more aware of and mindful of just the world that they live in. As in a matter of fact, a lot of people our age and older tend to be a little bit more closed-minded.
That just seems to be part of aging, right? Like the older you get, the more closed-minded you become. I hate to make such a sweeping generalization, but it's one time, I can't remember exactly when, I heard this or I read this explanation of aging that I just love, and I've noticed it even in myself, is that the true sign of aging is when you are no longer willing to understand new technology.
See, I think about that one often, because I've seen that in play many times, but then there will come this outlier that I see that's like an 80-year-old using an iPad with ease, and I think, oh, well, okay, there's definitely a mental aspect of like just committing to I'm not going to be left behind, or I'm going to stay up to speed with this stuff. But
you're speaking to a willingness to adapt, right? That's how I would characterize it.
Very well put.
And that's what made me think about what we were talking about is, look, I am not going to use Snapchat, right? I am 38 years old, and I have no interest in learning how to use this thing, right? And that's how I know that I am getting older, right? And there's going to be the next thing. Now it's TikTok. Then after TikTok, there's going to be another thing. And
Yeah.
and I will have some cultural understanding of these things because I like to stay informed and because it's part of like I kind of have to know about these things to connect with teenagers.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to learn how to use them. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with like having parameters of my livelihood.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not going to correlate my lack of interest in learning some new technologies to my overall closed-mindedness. I think through this conversation we're having today, we can all agree that we come from similar viewpoints in terms of wanting to have
Right.
progressive policies in our country, or at least in our state. But yeah, it is interesting how people can grow more closed-minded as they age and justify it. I'm too old for that. Sometimes people will say that.
Oh, yeah, and I think there's also a physiological part to it too. As we get older, we used a lot of energy, a lot of brain power, establishing ourselves in life. Going to college, learning things, just doing so much through life to get established and find our purpose in our life. That as we get older, we're tired. And sometimes, I'm serious, and we don't have the energy. We don't want,
Yeah.
We have a lot on our plate already. So why put another thing on our plate? Why do I need to learn this other thing? Is it really necessary?
And it's worth saying too that our storage capacity in our brain is not what it used to be, and
Yeah.
our brain has also shrunk a little.
Yeah, I mean, but there's that factor that. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
But I would also, I would add to you, or at least kind of maybe take it in a little bit of a different path, is there's also the reticence to, like, I would also call that a reticence to grow, right? Like, so, the three of us might be able to remember a specific term that we used in high school or middle school that we don't use anymore as a culture, or that we come away from. And sometimes people are like, I don't care. I don't like that. I'm going to still use that word because it means something different to me, right? And so there's still that reluctance to change can be rooted in like, well, this is the way that it did it for me, and I don't want to change that way because I thought it was fine.
Right. Nostalgia definitely plays a role. The emotional ties to how a thing was when we were like coming of age. And I try to point that out to a lot of people my age, our age, a lot of the time. Just because a thing was that way doesn't mean that we can't make something that's better, or that this thing that we currently have is no good just because it's not what we had.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird that myopic view of the past, because I'm sure we've seen it in our parents, where like every generation we tend to look back on that decade when we came of age and go, that's when stuff was great.
well, right. We tend to, right. Nostalgia can be quite hurtful in that way. I actually, not too long ago, was listening to a podcast, and someone was talking about that word and its Latin roots, and algia is translated from Latin to mean sickness.
Sickness. Huh.
Yes. And so I think nos was past. And so I think it literally translated to sickness from the past.
Wow. It sounds a lot like depression.
But even like from a cultural standpoint, earlier I was, I referenced the word, but when I was 14 or 15, I used the word retarded a lot.
Right.
Like if I didn't like something, it was retarded. If someone did something stupid, that was retarded. And
Right.
I don't use that word anymore because it means something very different. But there are still people that use that word that are our age because that's
Right.
just what they want to do.
Or
right?
they use the
they
word,
don't want to change.
Use the word gay in a negative
Yeah, no, exactly.
connotation. Yeah, I think you touched on something that's worth noting, which is that that personal commitment to growth, to saying like, well,
Right.
I choose to continue to grow as I age.
And I think it's this, I guess it's this acknowledgement that people can work towards, which is just because it doesn't make sense to me doesn't mean it's wrong.
Right. Yeah, like I still stand by some of the best music coming out of the early to mid 90s. But hey, others would
Sure.
call
Oh, no,
me a
of course.
nostalgic old dingleberry. And I'm sure plenty of people could make an argument to a counter argument to my point. But hey, Nirvana's freaking
Well,
awesome.
that's right. Well, every generation believes their music is the best, right?
Yeah.
We can laugh at that, but Nirvana is the best.
Right. Exactly. You know,
That being
and like
said,
I would say the same thing about the Beatles. They're one of the best bands of
sure,
all time. But do I think
right?
that Herman's Hermits is? No, they don't even make the top 40.
Yeah, and then in that aspect too, like with that music, it's not just the music; it's that music. The reason certain generations say that their music is the best is because psychologically, it brings you back to some of the best times of your life or good memories. There's a great connection there to your childhood or your teenagehood.
Yeah.
And
Oh yeah,
that's why
for sure.
that's why you like that music. That music brings you back. Like when I hear my dad and the music he listens to, like as a 75-year-old man, he puts that music on because it takes him back to when he was a young man dancing, breaking it down, and So
Yeah.
there's this psychological part too of like that pleasure that they felt with that music and what it brings them back to and the memory and everything.
Oh
True.
yeah, it transports you for sure.
You create a bond with it.
True, man. Very well put.
But I want to say something real quick.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to say something that Matt said earlier that does, give you a lot of hope that he is right. The young people, and I don't like using the word mental illness. It's mental health. You come to therapy to work on your mind. You go to gym to work on your body,
Right.
But it's mental health. We all need, if we're going to take care of our bodies, we need to take care of our minds. And the thing is, like, he made a very good point that the young people, and when we use the word crazy, we learned that, not throwing old generations under the rug, but because of their anxiety and the fear of the unknown, when they dealt with schizophrenics that were delusional and hallucinal and quote unquote acting crazy,
Yeah.
they didn't know what the heck it was. They didn't know what it was. There was research to be done. There was medicine to be created. And now, back then, there was that, oh, they're crazy. They labeled them in a negative way just because they didn't understand.
Right.
Right. And now it's true. The younger generation is more accepting. They will talk about anxiety. They will talk about depression. They will talk about things and they're more gender, accepting. They ain't like she's gay and he's gay. I mean, they might use that word as a loaded word, like slang, like, well, that's scary. I don't want to do that. But they're way more open-minded. They're not like, I'm going to throw my generation on the bus where, in the 80s, if you were gay, they picked on you and they were mean, right?
Yeah.
Right.
A lot more acceptance when it comes to things like that. That, the kids feel more free if they want to, wear something, they'll wear it.
Yeah.
Where they don't feel so targeted. So no, the younger generation, millennials or whatever, they are definitely, talking about stuff more. And that's why, they're going to be a big part of growing mental health services and,
True.
and meeting some of these goals that we want to happen.
Right.
Yeah, good
Well,
point.
and that, even when we kind of bring it back to the protest, seeing all these young people being activated in addition to everything that you just said, Angel, it really gives me hope for the future. It gives me hope for the upcoming election, that this is a generation that maybe can make some major changes to our country, changes that I think will be good.
Yeah, and changes that are overdue in many departments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I hope that people younger than us are driven to take part in politics, that some people will choose to serve in public office, as well as people who want to work in the mental health field. And we can do things like give better funding to mental health, as well as pay teachers better.
Yeah, no kidding.
That'd be great.
And me too. I'm fine.
So the only other thing I was going to touch on, and I won't go too deep into this article, but I was reading this really interesting article from BBC. It's titled "How East and West Think in Profoundly Different Ways." But it basically was making the point how, based on geography and the culture that you come from, that has an impact on how you view mental health and how you address it.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. Culture definitely plays a big factor. I know that as a Latino person.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a time I had a client who was from a part of Asia, and this client pretty much had like a complete denial of mental health even being a component of addressing the issues at hand. It was a huge obstacle. But on the
Yeah,
other,
I would probably go ahead.
I was just going to say, on the other hand, though, that person's culture was had a strong belief that holistic medicine was where it's at, as opposed
Right.
to us using pharmaceuticals.
It's ironic, huh?
Yeah.
I was going to say, I would guess that the two biggest barriers to mental health are culture and resources, or, financial resources, because I would agree that there are cultural stigmas or barriers that prevent someone from even being open to asking for help,
Yeah.
whether that's with white men or American men or Asian cultures or Latino cultures or African cultures. Like,
I would even
it's almost
say
like,
my own family, until I really became friends with Angel and started to learn the field of mental health, I would have been in the
mhm,
same boat. Like, oh, that's just not something we do.
right, right.
Yeah, and also remember,
Um,
they're gonna fight it. There's a like the way I describe even anxiety is that it is very tied to like an old brain, our fight, flight, freeze response, right?
Uh huh.
And as soon as you tell somebody from a different culture something that they never learned, they never discussed anxiety, they never discussed depression or whatever, and so for them it's almost like now they're going to have to reach a level of understanding. But to reach that level of understanding, that takes energy, it takes commitment, it takes time. So they view it as a stressor, and quickly they get anxious and get frustrated and not want to fight it.
Which leads to
Right there,
anger.
again, they go straight to the fight response because, like I said, anxiety to me is very tied to that fight, flight, freeze response.
Yeah.
So they get very anxious of you telling them something that they don't want to accept or fear the unknown, or they know that, man, am I going to have to accept this and then totally change my way of thinking? That's a lot of work, So
Right.
they fight it, and then you have to break that barrier. You gotta break that fight because as a mental health professional and all that, that's your job. Because even with teenagers, when I work with teenagers, because they're coming in because their parents make them come in, they're in an anxious state of mind.
Yeah.
And what do you think? You think they're in a fight or flight or freeze response? No, they're ready to kind of fight. Their body is shaking, they're sweating, their blood pressure's up.
Yeah.
And remember, hormones are shooting, and they think they're in danger. And like I said, anger and anxiety make us very irrational. And sometimes they're ready to fight. They think I'm the enemy, right?
Yeah.
If you grow up in a family that doesn't talk about problems or that stigmatizes mental health as not a thing, or only weak people or quote unquote crazy people go to counseling, what that ends up doing is it ends up, like you said, causing people to internalize what's happening. And then you probably see higher to violence or anger or higher rates of substance abuse because, when you're being told these things that you're feeling aren't valid because in this family or in this culture, we don't deal with them, you have to find another way to deal with it. And I think the things that I said earlier are the ways that a lot of people go. Jeff, when your statement earlier about Asian cultures, like, isn't there an island in Japan where people go to kill themselves, like after they've shamed their family?
That's actually the island that's mentioned in this article by the BBC. If you want
and so, like, that obviously has some serious implications as far as mental health. But then again, it's also very easy for us as Americans with some education in this realm to kind of judge another culture on how they're handling certain things, right? It's sort of what we were saying about earlier. There's an element of not understanding or disconnect. Now, I don't know that it's totally out of character to say, well, I think there be a place where people can go kill themselves is okay. I don't know that would ever be the case, but obviously in that culture, it's okay.
Right. There's definitely some the culture of honor and pride.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's almost like the way that we canonize veterans that are killed on the line, in battle or injured in the line of duty. It's that same sort of honor, and that maybe. Again, I don't know a Japanese family that has had a person go to that island and kill themselves, so I don't know how they feel about it, but maybe there's a sense of pride that, yeah, he or she did the right thing.
That makes me think of... Go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say the only other thought I had based on what Angel was talking about was that I've had some teenagers come in when their parents want me to be the parent, right? So they not only... Sometimes as a teenager already believes that it's dangerous or I'm the bad guy, but the parent actually is expecting me to be the bad guy, is expecting me to be the disciplinarian when they get caught smoking weed or when they caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. It's like, oh, now I'm going to go take you to see Matt because you got in trouble. And it's never a pleasant conversation to be like, well, actually, parent, you're not really doing this the right way. It's your job as parent to be the disciplinarian. It's my job as therapist to help your child understand maybe what was going on that motivated them to do what they did.
Right.
Probably they did what they did because of how you're trying to make me be the parent.
Right.
Yeah.
Case in point.
They probably just want to say, notice me, Mom. Notice me, Dad.
You know what, as you mentioned, like how we tend to elevate people of our military, Matt, it also got me thinking about the police. And that very recently, first let me just say, we all need to realize how people in politics and people on television often work to divide us with ideas. But
and influence.
The idea that if we are having a conversation about police brutality and we're having conversations about the idea of defunding police to give more money to certain departments, that somehow that equates to us being completely against police and that we're just shitting on all police everywhere is really ridiculous. I don't think anyone is saying like all cops are evil racist pricks. I think what people are saying is like, look, we've had enough of people being needlessly shot and killed and brutalized, and we've had enough of inequality and injustice, and now we want to address all these things right now. But somehow that turns on the other side to, you're against the police and you're 1 degree of separation away from a commie bastard. So I guess I was just trying to say, I think people need to be aware of how people with platforms pit us against each other.
Oh, sure. The TV news, they're in the business of making money, and they make money by advertisers, and advertisers pay them money by getting people to watch. And so they're not interested in creating civil discourse, I don't think. They're interested in taking extreme positions in order to create arguments, in order to make quote unquote compelling television, in order to get money.
When I say put us against each other, I don't mean like, and I like, Matt, that you pointed out the, sometimes my words are not as detailed and specific as they should be, but their number one goal is to get you to keep watching. And if they weave this tapestry of how one side is ridiculous and one side is the
and I think a big part of it too is that like you said, they got to keep you interested, right? And I do think anxiety, which in many ways is fear, is a big part of it. And I think politicians and people that social influences, they have evolved. They're very intelligent, and they know how to keep a lot of people in a very anxious state of mind, very worried, and that's why they turn on the news. What's going on? What's happening?
Yeah.
Right? And they're putting on and Because remember, I mean, rulers used to rule by fear in a very physical way. You didn't agree, we chop your head off, right?
Yeah.
They can't do that as much anymore, right? It's
As
inhumane,
much.
right?
Yeah.
Right. So I'm just saying, like now they have evolved. They have evolved, and now they know about psychology. They know about anxiety. And they know how to promote a lot of fear, a lot of worry, a lot of doubt, and create a lot of social anxiety. My practice, lately I deal with a lot of social anxiety just because people are dealing with a lot of unknowns. They are laid off,
Yeah.
they are furloughed, they're waiting on their
COVID-19.
unemployment check. Yeah, COVID-19, and then you got the whole dynamic of life changing, and now people trying to get back in the swing of things and getting parts of their life back. But remember, I mean, and what's weird to me, and I don't want to go here very long, but if it wasn't for all these things, the election would be talked about so much this year, and it's been very neglected in many ways,
Yeah.
right? Because of so much that's going on. But the thing is, like, we have to remember that there is people out there that want to influence us, and we have to be mindful of that. Be mindful of who we are and who we want to be and what we want in our lives.
Yeah.
Because we all want a lot of things. No one wants to live in fear and anxiety, and we want confidence, we want love, we want happiness. We all want these things. I don't care what race and culture you are. No one wants to live in fear. No one wants to live in insecure. No one wants to live in toxicity. Like right now, like I said, they have evolved. The people that do influence us, and they know how to promote a different type of fear now, and we got to be mindful of it.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of this book that I was reading several weeks ago, and I've mentioned it on the show before, but I just think it's a really great book. It's called Hate Incorporated. It's by Matt Taibbi. He's a journalist for Rolling Stone. And, essentially the whole book is about how, you've got channels like MSNBC and Fox News who are two sides of the same coin, and how it's largely a show designed to keep you engaged and watching. But I don't want to spend too much time on this subject. Millions of us talk about this all the time, but there was one final question I wanted to ask you guys. What advice would you have for someone who wants to quit drinking or smoking or quit using a substance, but is a person who manages their life well in the eyes of society?
That's a great question. So I would, you touch on two important things, I think, Jeff. One is having to identify a motivation to change. So if a person is what we'll call relatively stable or high functioning in life, but they worry that they might use a substance too much, whether it's drinking, smoking, it could be caffeine, it could be anything, right?
Uh-huh.
We have that sort of change. Then we have the other sort of change, right? When I learned about pure, what we'll call behavioral therapy, right, which is essentially how do you get people to change behaviors, there has to be a reason to want to change. A lot of times for people in relation to substance abuse, it's hitting some sort of bottom, right? It's something happening in your life that has maybe irrevocably changed it, right? Whether that's getting fired from a job or losing a relationship or getting into a car accident or getting a DUI. And so those are generally the two ways that people become aware, right? One is having that insight to say, I think I might be doing this too much. I don't love the way I feel the next day, or I'm gaining some weight that I don't want to gain. Another is when something happens directly because of your behaviors. Either way, the way that I try to approach it is the best way to change the behavior is to have a replacement behavior. Mm-hmm. When we think of drinking, we start to think about, well, what are the positives that drinking brings to a person's life? And how do we find similar things in other areas? So if one of the things you like about drinking is it allows you to get out and talk to people, well, now we can start to say, like, well, what are some other ways that you can get out and talk to people without drinking, or maybe without in a bar environment, right? Could you join a sports league, recreational league, or could you join a political action committee or a social action committee to kind of get out and meet people without having the alcohol around you, and kind of brainstorming from there. But when you want to change your behavior, I guess to distill it down, I think that when you want to change a behavior, it's really important to have a replacement behavior. It doesn't always have to be equal. Sometimes instead of drinking, someone's going to say, I'm going to go for a run. I'm going to work towards that quote unquote runner's high to kind of create the endorphins and release the neurochemicals in my body that might give me a similar feeling, maybe a better feeling than I do when I drink. So that would be my suggestion.
That's a good one. You made me think of how in the past I've heard if you're a smoker who's trying to quit, you could do a thing like carry a package of gum, and every time you're tempted to have a cigarette, like pop some of that fresh minty gum in your mouth, and then you'll be like, well, I've got this fresh minty, taste. I don't really want to smoke now.
Right. And, something like nicotine, even to an extent alcohol or other substances, we have to also account for the addictive nature of these things.
Right.
So it's hard to tell a person that's been smoking for 20 years to quit cold turkey because they're going to go through withdrawals, right? You can look at using a patch or using nicotine gum or other methods to still get the nicotine without smoking, inhaling, all of those horrible components.
Right.
And then eventually kind of titrating yourself down on the nicotine. So you start at a certain level, and after 2 weeks, you drop down a little bit. After 2 weeks, you drop down a little bit. And then you also, that would be a great opportunity to also try to replace that behavior. I think another big thing when it comes to smoking, maybe when it comes to drinking, is what is the driving factor here, right? Like trying to develop some insight about why you go for a cigarette when you go for a cigarette. Are you bored? Are you anxious? Are you
right?
Do you need a break to get up from your desk at work, and that's the only excuse you have to go outside? Same thing with alcohol. Do you have a hard time talking to people you don't know, and does alcohol kind of lubricate yourself to be a little bit more spontaneous, a little bit more impulsive? Or do you drink when you feel really sad because you don't want to feel that way? And so identifying some underlying behaviors can also start to help us understand, like, okay, if I smoke when I'm nervous, but I don't want to smoke when I'm nervous, what else can I do when I'm nervous? I could chew gum, or I could get one of those tension balls and squeeze it, or I could, go run around the block.
Yeah.
It becomes a lot easier to come up with replacement behaviors when you're able to identify the underlying cause.
Yeah, well put. And you made me think of something when you were addressing like a person who smokes cigarettes and how many times a day and why are you smoking that cigarette. I've tried to tell some people that I've known before about how I quit smoking, and I smoked for, around 15 years. And part of that process was identifying those times, trying to break my day down into segments and saying, all right, well, why do I have this one?
Right.
That really allowed me to take each cigarette of the day and go, you almost look at it like arithmetic and saying, well, where can I subtract one that's not really needed? That allowed me to slowly whittle it down to where, let's say, I was maybe smoking like 10 cigarettes a day. By the time I had subtracted out 5, then it was like, all right, so why do I still have these? And, I told people, like, I've had this conversation, I think, with Angel before about how we actually have nicotine receptors in our brain. So we have an actual, like, chemical system set up to want that nicotine. But what I realized really quickly was, and this is anecdotally from myself, it just felt like when I had that first day's cigarette, the first one, that then set up my body to have another craving in a shorter amount of time.
Sure.
So once I realized that, I said, oh, okay, here's what I'm going to try. I'm not going to smoke my first cigarette of the day until my body's absolutely screaming for it. Because a lot of smokers, like, what I was doing back then was I'd get up, have my morning coffee, smoke a cigarette with it. Oh, coffee and cigarettes are so good together. That was my mentality.
Thank you, bro.
Yeah. Or like smokers are always, after a meal, the first thing you want is a cigarette. Once I identified those things, I could go, all right, I'm not going to do that. And,
Right. I think that's...
Go ahead.
I think that's really important to recognize, right? I would call that the ritualization of an addiction, right? Is there are certain things that just go together.
Yeah.
and I don't ask myself why, I just do them. Or I've conditioned myself to anticipate that first cigarette of the day because it's the best one. And I think that if you describe that you did it, and you can identify when that's happening and why, that's the insight needed to make changes.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, Pavlov, right? Like the experiment that he did with the dogs.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that ringing a bell meant food, so they anticipated it. And I hate to maybe seem like I'm oversimplifying behaviors, but they are quite simple when it comes down to it, human behavior. A lot of times, just like you described, taking some time to cultivate the insight into your behaviors is all you really need to then develop a plan to make changes.
Very true.
Well, that being said, drinking and smoking, it's a lot easier said than done to just implement those changes.
Yeah. I mean, you have to recognize that culturally, we have an American culture that's very heavily steeped in drinking.
Oh, my gosh. Yes.
How many social events are there out there? Like, I've been participating in political stuff very recently, and even one of those, join us for cocktails and conversation. So it's just it's everywhere.
Yeah. How about after you play co-ed soccer, you all go for a drink, or after you go for a run, you go have a drink.
Dude, that was such a great workout. You want to go drink?
Ultra, that's their Michelob Ultra. Don't they advertise to athletes?
Yeah.
Isn't that their whole thing?
Yeah. Disclaimer: do not drink and handle weights.
Right.
Angel, do you have anything you want to add to any advice you give to someone who wants to quit using a substance that maybe from outside perspective, people don't think that they have a problem?
Well, I'll keep it real simple. Because of my therapeutic approach, I don't believe in no such thing as functional alcoholic or anything like that. I think they could function when, maybe they're going to work, paying the bills and all those things,
Yeah.
But to be an addict, an alcoholic takes a lot of time and energy. And what I mean by that is they're going to come home and they're going to maybe go in the garage and drink, and that's going to take their time and energy from being away from their wife or their kids. And that's why I don't believe in a functional alcoholic, because, again, the word denial. They're denying the relationships in their lives and things in their life that are not that functional or not that healthy. Because as they get older, and I know in therapy, when you see the 52-year-old man come in because, quote unquote, he's been a functioning alcoholic. He's been going to work and paying the bills and all those things. But now his wife has had enough, where this thing has taken so much time and energy and away from their relationship. It's almost like the other woman.
Yeah.
And my only advice is that's another level of denial, because there's no such thing as a functioning addict. There's always underlying issues or life areas that are being neglected. Yeah. And the thing is, if they are going to make that, they got to see it as a life change, as a growing moment. It's not them against alcohol. They are getting themselves back and their life back. That it's a growing moment, and they have to focus on internal work and changing themselves. Because remember, if you are an alcoholic, you're drinking when you're happy and you're drinking when you're sad. It encompasses all feelings. So now, you got to learn who you are and how you feel, and find out if there was underlying issues. Why did you start drinking at 18 or 14? And start, again, looking at that personal truth and embracing your life. Because, if you can say you love your wife, but why is this thing taking so much time and energy from her undivided attention? And sometimes a big step with people dealing with that, is getting things that describe love back. Realizing that, love is empathetic and respectful and loyal and understanding and all those things, and that alcohol is breaking that. You're not being loyal to your wife. You're not being loyal to your kids. You're not being empathetic to your kids. You're out drinking in the garage. You focus on these types of things and your personal love for yourself and the love for others, and realizing that this is a growing moment, a life change. And that's how you have to embrace it and take complete responsibility for it. But like I said, it takes time. And that's why these people need people that are very supportive, very forgiving, not people that are judgmental and every time they relapse, are going to be critical.
Mm-hmm.
They need a lot of encouragement, a lot of support, a lot of love, and they need to love themselves. Because remember, I mean, I'm also a big believer. You gotta love yourself to love others. And a lot of addicts, there's stuff inside that they blame themselves for, that they are angry about, and they got to start taking care of yourself, and and all these things. And that's all I have to say. I'll keep it simple like that.
Cool. Well put. Something that came to mind is like the type of person that maybe doesn't appear to be neglecting relationships, but so something that springs to mind is the DSM-5 definition. One of the definitions or bullet points under alcohol substance abuse is if you enter into a situation in which you drink and you drink more than intended. So let's say you went in under the mindset of, I'm going to have one, and one becomes 5, or, one even becomes 3. Like, that's one of the ways the DSM tries to define an alcohol substance
by number.
problem.
But I do think it's deeper than that. I think, like I said, we can define it because remember, they're looking for measurable things that they can measure and see about psychology. Remember, most of the things we deal with is feeling and thinking, and they're all abstract. We can't see them. And we got to really dig deep and get to know why this person, because there's a guy out there that can drink 10 beers on a Friday night, but he's not an addict, But there's a guy that drinks 7 and 10 beers, but he's on a mission. He's doing it for a reason. He's doing it for whatever stressor or whatever fear is going on or whatever depression is going on that he's not accepting. And, we really, like I said, and I know we know a lot about mental health, but we have to keep practicing these things with our clients, and hopefully our clients do it with their families and friends because I do believe in a very grassroots approach that if people did more in their community to provide more forgiveness, more empathy, more caring and understanding to all walks of life, and we learn this in a way, we do this in a community-based way, it'll grow.
Well, I really appreciate you guys being here today for this conversation. For our listeners, again, our guests today are Matt Rigberg and Angel Lopez. Do you guys have anything else you wanted to add?
I'll see you guys at the bar.
Yes.
Thanks for having us.
I'm working on making a face mask with a straw. All right. Well, thanks again, guys. That concludes our episode of Into the Foxhole. Again, I'm Jeff Fox. Everyone, stay safe and be well.